This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken kick off the show with another episode of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast. This week, the pair discuss managing established native grasslands. Keeping the show rolling is James Coover from the Wildcat District, Stacy Campbell with the Cottonwood District, and Andrea Burns from Ford County. These agriculture extension agents share how wheat harvest has been in their area. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show discussing biosecurity measures that dairy producers should consider implementing on their farms as we continue to learn more about the spread of the HPAI virus. That and more is coming up ahead. This is Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. You know, we've been out, Drew, I've been watching the grass grow in our part of the state. There's been quite a bit of good rain coming in, and things are popping up. So it's timely that we're chatting about the topic you have for us today. We're going to be talking about managing existing native grasslands. So last time we talked a little bit about how to, establish some habitat back into some of these grasslands. Today we're going to talk about a little bit about native grasslands. So why do we want to manage these grasslands?
Well, I think one of the biggest reasons is it's not going to stay grass if you don't do anything, and that's one of the big challenges that can be hard to realize especially if we're coming from different parts of the country where we've got big forests that stay forest for extended period of time without much intervention. Grasslands are really disturbance-dependent ecosystems. And so one of the important things that we have to realize when we're trying to manage grasslands for wildlife, whether it's a grassland that we planted or a grassland that already exists, is you probably need to do some things to that in order to produce the food, cover, and usable space that those critters need to have out there. And really, using disturbance as our tool to manipulate succession to get that desired plant community is how we do that.
I was taught kind of this intermediate disturbance hypothesis where we don't want to necessarily have no disturbance. You don't want to have a ton of disturbance. You want to kind of be somewhere in the middle that gives a lot of diversity. So maybe share your thoughts on that. But also, other than fire, what is a disturbance?
Yeah. So when we talk about disturbances and specifically thinking about disturbances that would occur in the tallgrass prairie, fire would have been one of those really common natural disturbances. It's also a human-caused disturbance that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. The Native Americans burned prairie, and really the natural fires due to lightning probably never occurred often enough to maintain tallgrass prairie. So tallgrass prairie and humans are sort of interconnected. There's probably only been tallgrass prairie as we know it as long as there's been humans on the North American continent. So that's kind of an interesting deal there. One of the reasons that scientists believe that, beyond just the evidence that we have from Native American communities, is that, dry lightning strikes that cause fires in tallgrass prairie don't happen that often. And you have to have a drought. You have to have a system come through where you have lightning that strikes away from where the rain's falling, or at least heavy enough rain where you have fuel and all those sorts of things. So that's not a really common occurrence. Grazing is another disturbance. So, historically, we would have had a host of large ungulates that grazed in the Great Plains. Bison are the species that people think about the most often, and they're probably the species that had the greatest individual impact on the plant community in the prairie because they were so numerous, and they also could consume the most vegetation per individual of any of these critters too. But we also had elk, and elk are sort of an intermediate forager. They're a species that eats a lot of grass. They also eat a lot of woody plants and also a lot of forb-type browse, too. So they would have been moving grass and eating woody plants and eating forbs. And further west, we've got pronghorn, and we've also got a whole bunch of little bitty grazers that nobody ever thinks about, like cotton rats and prairie voles and those sorts of critters out there on the prairie. But, their impact is probably quite a bit less. And then other disturbances, let's say a big windstorm or an ice storm came through and blew down a bunch of trees. Well, we can duplicate that with mechanical plant removal, right? We're selecting plants to cut down with a chainsaw or an axe, or if they're small enough, maybe loppers, or using a skid steer with a big saw to cut them down. And then there's chemical plant control as well, right? So that would be going out with some sort of herbicide that targets either a group of plants or a broad spectrum herbicide that would kill everything. And then one of the really important disturbances in prairie systems that we have absolutely no control over is drought. And so that's the other main disturbance that sort of shapes this ecosystem.
So all those, I would imagine, are a combination of those. Some of those we can control. Is it kind of you can use one of them, you kind of set it and forget it? What's what's your recommendation there if I want to go out and start managing disturbance on my land?
Sure. Well, one of the things you mentioned was the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And that sort of general way of thinking, whether we want to call it a theory or a hypothesis or whatever, there's situations where it seems to be true, and there's other situations where it seems to not necessarily be true. Let's say an intermediate disturbance would say that we burn once every 3 years and that we moderately or lightly graze in combination with that burning every 3 years. What that tends to do, unless you have a bunch of small parcels across the landscape where people are on different rotations of timing of applying that fire, you end up with the same sort of cover across a really broad area. And so you're managing for this sort of middle level where we see heterogeneity, and by heterogeneity I mean different stuff, different cover, different plants, different heights of cover, different density of cover in different years. So we see heterogeneity across time because we burn 1 year and then the grass grows, and then the second year we've already got an established height of plants and cover, and then we grow more the third year, and then we burn it and we start over. So we get heterogeneity through time. Whereas if we do things a little differently, we can get the same type of heterogeneity both in space and time. In order to do that on the same property, you have to manage for really intense disturbance, but not apply that really intense disturbance to the same spot on the landscape every year. So one way to achieve that would be to overgraze 20 acres of a 60-acre property. Maybe you also apply fire to that 20 acres of that 60-acre property this year, and you don't have any fences out there, and you just let the cattle graze where they want to. They are going to graze the holy tar out of that spot that you burned this year, and they're not going to graze very much at all everywhere else. And then next year we burn a different spot, and they're going to graze the tar out of that. And they're pretty well going to leave that stuff that we burned last year alone, and they're going to leave the stuff that we haven't burned yet alone. And then in that third year, we burn the stuff that we haven't burned yet at all. So we are managing for a snapshot of really intense disturbance, but we're not reapplying that for several years.
Is grazing important for wildlife? What's that relationship, I guess, between the livestock and the wildlife?
So one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make when they buy a property for hunting in Kansas, and that property it already has prairie on it. One of the biggest mistakes I see them make is pulling the cattle off and saying, we're just going to let this go back to nature. Yeah. The reality is that nature for that piece of ground was Native Americans burning it when it had enough fuel on it to burn, and many, many, many nomadic bison coming through and grazing the tar out of it as they moved across this prairie landscape. So cattle are really the surrogate for bison in this system, and they're incredibly important for producing the plant diversity that provides food and cover for all of our wildlife, whether it's deer or turkeys or quail or pheasants out in these prairie ecosystems, because as that grass grows up, it has a competitive advantage over the forbs, or those broadleaf plants that are going to be food.
If cattle aren't an option, are there other things that we can do to maybe not as well, but close to as well mimic what the cattle are doing?
Sure. It's not going to mimic it, but there are some ways that we can hay that can help promote plant diversity. The big challenge with haying is it's not selective like cattle grazing is. We don't have swathers that can just cut the grass and leave the forbs there, right? Or, leave a patch of grass that's residual here and not there. So the way that we would want to hay if we're using haying, and I'm not talking about haying to produce forage for cattle. I'm not saying that farmers should do this if wildlife is not part of their goal, right? But if wildlife is part of the goal, then haying in thirds could sort of lend itself to producing more of the type of heterogeneity out there that we want to see. So we're removing swaths of that grass, giving the forbs a chance to sprout up, but we're not haying the whole meadow. We've got areas of residual cover that would be the nesting cover for quail or turkeys, or be the bedding cover for white-tailed deer that's out there. And then next year, we hay a different third. So we're doing things patchily so that we don't have the same amount of residual growth and all that sort of stuff in every spot out there in that hay meadow.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. You can listen to the full Fins, Fur, and Feathers episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. This is Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show with an update on wheat harvest with K-State Crop Production Agent in the Wildcat District, James Coover, Crop Production Extension Agent in the Cottonwood District, Stacy Campbell, and Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Ford County, Andrea Burns. They all join us today to give an update on wheat harvest in their area. We begin with James Coover in the Wildcat District. James, how's wheat harvest been going in your area?
Wheat harvest is looking pretty good. And so finally we've really dried out here in the southeast. And so as soon as the ground got hard enough, we started rolling in the combines. So we probably I'd say about halfway done with wheat harvest by now.
And what have yields been looking like?
So the yields have been pretty good. And so of course, down here in the southeast, we have both soft wheat and hard wheat. So we got to look at both of those. The soft wheat, the yields have been probably in the 90s, less than last year. I don't think we've had very many fields have broken the 100 bushel threshold yet, but for the most part, 80s and 90s are looking pretty good. So for the hard wheat, though, I'd say those numbers are more in the 50s and 60s, which is also a pretty good yield as well. And so our yields aren't as well as they were last year. We were really shaping up for it, but the last 3 weeks of rain right before harvest, or right before, during flowering all the way through, kind of reduced the quality down a little bit to take the yields down. And so our test weights, though, have been pretty decent. The test weights for the soft have been 57 to 58. For the hard wheat, they've been 59 to 60. So, fairly decent.
Have there really been any concerns in southeast Kansas for wheat harvest?
And so the real main concern here in southeast, which is most years, and this one as well, was the vomitoxin, the head scab in the wheat that creates, the DON is the chemical they're actually testing for. And so the vomitoxin numbers, because it was rainy during the flowering period, that head scab gets in there and might create that toxin. So we were a little bit concerned about that because we really had the perfect weather for an outbreak. But for the most part, our vomitoxin has been fairly low. There have been some, loads that have come into the co-ops that they've been testing for, and some of those have come up hot, but not very often. And so, I don't know, I think people, for the most part, the co-ops are pretty happy with the wheat that's coming in, but they're testing every single load. And that's pretty common when there's a risk to vomitoxin. And so, of course, if they get over a certain threshold, the ports are going to stop accepting it. So the co-ops, they're really looking for it because they don't want to get stuck with hot wheat. So, but I would say that so far we've been kind of out of the woods on that one. Although, we like to harvest good wheat first, of course. The wheat that's laid down, the other wheat, that stuff, it has a little more risk of a lower test weight, but also possibly a higher risk of vomitoxin. And so we might start to get to that stuff later on, but for the most part, right now, we look pretty good.
What has the sentiment of your farmers been around wheat harvest?
So I think for the most part, they're pretty hopeful. I mean, really, they're getting it done pretty fast. It hasn't rained here in a while. I mean, everything is looking really dried out. And so there really isn't a field out there that isn't ready to be harvested. And they're really going at it pretty fast. And of course, right in there, behind there, we're planting our double crop soybeans too.
James, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us how wheat harvest is going in your region.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was K-State Crop Production Agent in the Wildcat District, James Coover. We're now going to be joined by Crop Production Extension Agent in the Cottonwood District, Stacy Campbell. Stacy, how has wheat harvest been going in the Cottonwood District?
Sure, yeah, wheat harvest, now that it's been getting hot and windy, the wheat is really dried down in a hurry and it's progressing along pretty quickly. In Barton County, it kind of does depend in the county where you're at. West of Barton County, they've had a little more rain. They're not quite as far along, maybe a third to 40% done. Other parts of Barton County, they're probably, as of this morning on June the 17th, they're probably 50% done with wheat harvest. And, the yields this year are just kind of very variable. They seem to be all over the place depending on, who caught moisture, when they planted, and so forth. And test weights have been good so far. Hearing anywhere from kind of 58 on the low end to 63, 64 on some test weights, and the actual protein has been good. It's basically good to high on the protein so far, so that's been a good thing.
What about for Ellis County?
So yeah, for Ellis County, obviously harvest isn't quite as far along. Probably as of this morning on the 17th, about 25% done. Yields, again, very variable. Summer fallows doing better than continuous, obviously. There's been hail damage in both counties, especially, I think, Barton County. So that always factors in and makes a difference. Once again, in Ellis County, the test weights are holding up good, that 58 to 61, and the proteins seem to be good as well. And also, I might mention, Shelby, in Barton County, 2 or 3 people told me if there's no rain this week, they'd probably be done in a week. Probably by this time next week, if there's no rain, they would be done.
Have there really been any concerns as wheat harvest seems to be moving pretty quickly?
No, not that I'm hearing of. There hasn't been really any concerns. I guess the one flip side to that, and I think most people know it, is it's not really wheat related, but they come out of the wheat. The chinch bugs have sure been a problem again this year. Going over, if you've got wheat adjacent to a grain sorghum or even a sorghum Sudan hay field, that you're growing feed for your cows, the chinch bugs are coming out of that maturing wheat. The nymphs, they walk, they can't fly yet. And they're really, taking out, not the whole field by any means. They'll take out the edges, 8, 10, 12 rows or so. So that's certainly happening in Barton County. It's probably the worst that they've seen it so far since we've had the chinch bugs really become a problem in the last 8 or 10 years.
Stacy, what would you say is the sentiment of your farmers around wheat harvest right now?
I really guess I haven't asked them. I think maybe there's been some surprises on some of the yields. Some pleasant surprises, and then there's probably also been some disappointments because I know this year stripe rust was certainly, even though we were dry, we had just enough moisture. Stripe rust was further south of us. If you had susceptible variety, there was certainly stripe rust on our wheat this year, so I think there's probably going to be some head scratching as to why maybe my wheat didn't do better. It looked good, but guys just weren't too concerned about spraying for stripe rust. Haven't really heard them say that yet, but that would be kind of one of my thoughts as I was out looking and scouting in fields earlier.
Once again, that was Crop Production Extension Agent in the Cottonwood District, Stacy Campbell. We're now going to be joined by Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Ford County, Andrea Burns. Andrea, what has wheat harvest been looking like for Ford County?
It's been going well. It's kind of like a roller coaster. Some of it's surprisingly good, and some of it's not as good as we thought it might be because of the drought. So it has its ups and downs.
What have been some of those numbers coming from your farmers from wheat harvest?
The test weights are looking good, 62s. Some of it's better than they thought. I think a lot of it has been binned and just now getting to the elevator if they were saving seed wheat or whatever. But it's really good. Some of it's not so good. It just depends where you're at.
Seems to be a normal sentiment as we talk about the wheat crop. And have there been any concerns?
Getting it in before the storms, here we were in a drought, and now that wheat harvest has started, it seems like we're getting gully washers every day. We've also had some hail with some of those storms, and unfortunately that's taken out some of the good wheat, especially on the eastern side of the county. There's been some big hail storms in the last couple of weeks that have taken out some good wheat. Hoping to, keep it dry enough that the combines can still get in the field without doing too much damage so that they can get the good stuff in.
And have you been seeing that most of your farmers have gotten their good stuff out of the field?
The few co-ops I've talked to, they said they all started with the good stuff, and so hopefully they've gotten it all in before the storms came.
How are your farmers really feeling as they're progressing through this harvest?
Some of them are pleasantly surprised. It's better than they thought it was going to be. There's some fields that they won't cut, but they kind of knew that going in. But the ones they did have to cut, there's some good spots, and they'll make frequent trips to the co-op. And then there's some real thin, short wheat that it takes them a while to fill a truck. So it just has its ups and downs.
And where are you at in percentage of being done for wheat harvest?
Some people are just now really getting started. Some people have been going for a while, but it just kind of depends on where they're at and what the weather's done for them, because not every part of the county has gotten rain. So if they miss those rainstorms, they're still able to cut. If they didn't, then they were kind of at a standstill. Anything else about wheat harvest you'd like to share for Ford County? Keep your fingers crossed that it stays good, that the hailstorms stay away, and that we're able to get done and move on to fall crops. Andrea, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update on the wheat harvest. You're welcome. Thank you. That was Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Ford County, Andrea Burns, and she was joined by Wildcat District's James Coover and Stacy Campbell from the Cottonwood District as they gave an update on how wheat harvest is going in their area. As a reminder, you can always stay up to date with how wheat harvest is going by following along with Kansas Wheat. You can do that by checking out their social medias or by finding them online at kswheat.com. Again, that is kswheat.com. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As more is being learned about the transmission of HPAI, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says there are some steps that producers can take now to reduce exposure to the virus.
Today I'd like to address our Kansas dairy industry and encourage them to consider the biosecurity practices on their farm. In the last several weeks, we've talked several times about HPAI and the virus that is spreading through dairy cattle across the United States. And as we learn more about this virus and how it spreads, we're finding out that there may be many different carriers of this virus onto our dairies. So today I'd just like to cover a few things with our dairy producers concerning some things that you can do to enhance your biosecurity on your own individual dairy farms. I would say that this virus will probably be with us for some time. It is naturally occurring, and as we learn more about the different species of animals that have been impacted by this virus, we find that there are many different types of carriers that we might see onto our dairy farms. We do know that it is spread by wild birds, and we're finding out that other species of wildlife can also carry it as well. So, number one, you need to minimize the access of wild birds to your cattle and the environment that you're animals live in. And as you do this, you might also consider minimizing the access that potential rodents have to your feeds as well as your cattle barns. Next thing we need to consider is the movement of animals and their transport. Again, if you're moving lactating dairy cows, you need to comply with the rules for in-state as well as out-of-state transport of those animals. Even if you're moving heifers inside and outside the state of Kansas, you need to be aware that there have been reports that transport of heifers have impacted the spread of HPAI to lactating dairy cows in some instances, not in all, but in some. So knowing the health status of the heifers as they come to your farm would be very important. The other thing that we're looking at in terms of biosecurity is really limiting the contact that livestock have with people. Again, we don't fully understand how and if people can actually spread the virus farm to farm, but in biosecurity situations, we always want to limit the people that actually have access to livestock on our farms. Only essential people should have access to our animals, and if you're having consultants come from the outside to look at animals or have contact with animals, practicing biosecurity and utilizing PPE in those instances would be very important. Now, on our own farm, should we have an issue with HPAI, or if we want to be very stringent in our biosecurity guidelines, you need to consider what you're doing with colostrum and raw milk. If you're feeding this to calves, it should be pasteurized before feeding to ensure that if there is virus present, that it would be killed before it's fed to those calves or other animals that you might feed it to. As you look at isolation practices on your farms, if you have animals that leave the farm, standard procedure for bringing them back on would be to isolate them for 30 days to make sure that they do not develop symptoms of HPAI due to exposure that they had when they were off the farm. As we look at our caretakers and taking care of them, we want to make sure that we do not have people consuming unpasteurized raw milk or other products that might be made from milk that might be suspected to be contaminated with HPAI. Also, for those workers working with animals that are expected to be infected, wearing protective gear to cover the eyes, nose, mouth, and hands would be important as well. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farms to consider the biosecurity controls on their farm to help prevent the spread of HPAI within our dairy herds.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.